Meetups, y tú sabes que wherever there's boricuas and we're talking about building and we're talking about making sure that we're still around, nunca puede faltar la cultura. Our beautiful black music from Puerto Rico, which is La Bomba. So this is, we're dancing with our ancestors, we are honoring our ancestors. Y estamos aquí en Humboldt Park. So qué rico que siempre cuando hay algo aquí, suenan los barriles aquí, because this is how we activate spaces. This is how we shift energy. And it's so needed when we are talking about such important stuff. So we are Las Bombleneras. We are 15 years old together. And we are also celebrating our Bomba school here, la Escuelita Bombera de Corazón. Many of you guys know we tenemos una escuela de bomba, beautiful, and we are also celebrating 15 years here in el pueblo. So, qué rico. Vamos a seguir bombeando. I know that we are playing music, pero este batey está abierto, so anybody that wants to come out and dance y tirar un piquete ahí, pues ya tú sabes que aquí se marca. Gracias a ustedes. Severito, So, en el coro de bomba es que activamos, ¿verdad? So, you're going to respond, agua, agua nada más. Agua, agua nada más. You know, water is a basic human right y no todo el mundo lo tiene. So, cuando cantemos bomba y me hagan ese coro, que le llegue el agua a la persona que no tenga agua. So, vamos a empezar. When we talk about community, and we talk about healing, and we talk about what it is to explore beautiful Afro-Indigenous music and Black music, we got to listen to it. We got to taste it. We got to feel it. We got to live it. We got to talk about it. We got to be in spaces. We have to be about it, right? And not only do we dig deep, but we got to dig in. And I'm so happy that I'm here. I'm born and raised here. And this conversation is going on in el barrio puertorriqueño. Gracias un montón. Y somos la
Yeah. ¿Me pueden oír? Yep. I'm going to ask all our panelists to please come up. Thank you. I'm going to ask everybody who's in the back to please come to the front. And everybody please take a seat so we can start our incredible program that we have for you this evening. So what another incredible performance by our partners, Bompleneras. I want to thank my sister, Ibelis Diaz, and her group, Bompleneras. They're amazing. Please, please, please work with them. Follow them on social media. They are for hire for workshops. They have classes. This is what we do as community. We got to support one another. So they're available. Talk to her. She's going to be here. And on behalf of our board of directors, we have our board chairman, David Hernandez, who's here. Raise your hand, David. We have Dr. Aida Giacello. There he is back there. Dr. Aida Giacello. And we have Professor Jose Lopez. On behalf of our staff, raise your hands. Woo! No bias, we got the best staff. And our president and CEO, Billy Ocasio, welcome to the National Museum of Puerto Rican Arts and Culture. I am Veronica Ocasio, your Director of Programming and Education. We are the only Puerto Rican museum in the United States. And soon we will be the only accredited museum in the United States. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that our organization is located on the ancestral lands of indigenous nations in Illinois. Sorry, I'm getting feedback. I don't know if it's me. We're good? Okay. We respectfully acknowledge that these ancestral lands were originally inhabited by the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi nations, as well as other tribal nations that know this area as their ancestral homeland, many whose names have been lost due to the tragic consequences of genocide. Despite their forced removal, displacement, and oppression, Chicago is still home to one of the largest Native communities in the United States, which is a testament to their enduring strength and resilience. We are committed as a community to continuing to support their important work as an ally and as an inclusive community organization. I also, this is me personally, want to say that I stand in solidarity with all the students peacefully protesting on college campuses across the United States. Their demonstrations are not about endorsing violence, but rather about protesting the violent responses in Gaza, where over 14,000 Palestinian children have been killed. What I'm about to say is not popular, especially as an organization seeking funds. However, it is necessary conversation we need to have in order to move our communities forward. Tonight, we gather not just to network and get to know each other, which is great, but to truly ignite change. I am inspired by the words of Roberto Clemente, who said, anytime you have the opportunity to make a difference in this world, and you do not, you are wasting your time on earth. I like to believe that each of you here today embodies that spirit, not only for yourselves, but for the communities you serve. Our goal here is to confront and dismantle the inequities in the distribution of resources that have historically marginalized and left behind communities of colors, communities like ours. We strive for a system that empowers and starts with our communities, not one that merely trickles down to them. You get me? We don't want that trickle down. We don't want the leftovers. And I extend my deepest gratitude to our panelists who are pioneering change and challenging the conventional norms of philanthropy. A special thanks to Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, our moderator, whose leadership and vision have brought us together to share in this critical discourse. Her commitment to not gatekeeping resources, but instead fostering a broad coalition is precisely what we need today in this moment. I also want to thank her team. Please raise your hands, Sandra, Ashley, and Olga. We've been working on this for 9 months, so thank you so much. And I also like to acknowledge again Billy and Perry Ermer, the president of the DuSable Museum, who have been tirelessly, literally working for justice, equity, and equality, not only currently at their museums, but for years at the various levels of government that they have served. They are always, if you see them two in the room, I promise you they're getting into trouble, but it's good trouble. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our board member and community professor, Jose Lopez, whose work at the Puerto Rican Culture Center, is a beacon of hope, and who is a symbol of liberation from all forms of oppression. Thank you, Jose. We find ourselves in a pivotal moment right now. Our museum, once doubted by many, you don't understand, you all, if this is your first time here, there was nothing, this was empty, no lights, no air. I know some of you are happy, there wasn't even circulation in here, no floors, no bathrooms. We were working out of a trailer in the park, and many doubted, could they make this happen? And here we are today as a symbol of resiliency and the power of community. Against all odds, we are thriving and pushing back against racism, displacement, and colonial narratives that sought to diminish us and ensure we did not have access to funding. We continue to fight this righteous fight. However, this is not new. We know that. This is not a new story. Throughout the last 5 centuries, European and US colonial powers have exerted control over various territories, including Puerto Rico, enacting policies that oppress, exploited, and disenfranchise primarily Black, Brown, Indigenous, and LGBTQ+ communities. These policies have a residual impact and are still alive and well today. You don't have to look far. Look at Florida, look at Texas. Look at the policies right now. They've established a system of discrimination that traumatically influenced our communities at multiple levels: economically, culturally, socially, spiritually, emotionally. And the legacy of colonialism permeates all aspects of life, influencing our identity, power dynamics, and knowledge of systems. It dictates who is seen as an authority, who leads, who has access, and who tells our stories. Decolonization begins by recognizing this and dismantling these unequal and harmful narratives. Decolonization is not just about correcting history, it's about reclaiming our power, our stories, and our future. Not only for us, but for 20, 50, 100 years from now. What is this gonna look like? So this process requires us to challenge systems that perpetuate division and put us in a position to fight for resources. In this book, Decolonizing Wealth, an indigenous man, Edgar Villanueva, asked the question, quote, given the level of trauma caused by what he calls the colonizer virus and wealth consolidation, can funders actually support transformational change? End quote. Despite these challenges, I believe there is indeed a path forward for funders to support transformational change. And as we as a community navigate these complexities of securing equitable funding, we know it's not easy, but our determination grows stronger every day. We are thankful for the commitment of tonight's panelists and all of you who have joined us. on this transformative journey. This discussion is just the beginning. In closing, I know that together we will change the narrative, ensuring future generations inherit a more equitable funding landscape. Thank you for being here, for your participation in this crucial conversation, and for committing to make a difference. So I would like to introduce our moderator. She is, sorry. And drop mic now. She is recognized globally for her contributions as a scholar, institution builder, cultural activist, narrative shifter. This is about a rap right here. Truth teller, author, cultural producer, and I love this one, Yoruba priestess. Yes. Dr. Marta Moreno Vega has advocated for cultural equity, cultural studies, and art as a tool for culture, social change, and education. She started her career as an elementary school teacher in New York City. I love teachers, I'm a teacher, woo! And since then, Dr. Moreno Vega has been invested in ensuring that the contributions of Africans and their descendants are integral to society throughout the Americas. She has served as a leader in many organizations. She's one of the founders of El Museo del Barrio, served as its second director in 1971 to the initiation of what we're here today, Creative Justice Initiative in 2017. Her intention to build an intergenerational inclusive platform to confront systemic inequality, which she has led fiercely. Yes. Dr. Moreno Vega also co-leads Afro Corredor out of Casa Afro in Loíza, Puerto Rico. If you haven't gone there, you have to go. It's amazing. She is a force, an institution, and a living legend. Please help me welcome our moderator, mentor, and friend, Dr. Marta Moreno Vega.
No hay nada que decir, ya lo dijo Victoria. ¿Qué? She's a force. And we are in a force. This building is a force. Why is it a force? Because you made it. The work of Billy, the work of Veronica, the work of all who created this space and all the spaces that surround this area, that's power. And the question today, and the question that we all should be addressing, is how do we sustain it? Because it's already done, right? Se puede tweak aquí, se puede tweak allá, se puede hacer un poquito más acá. It's done. But the narrative now, and I'm not saying anything that you don't know, is to victimize us, criminalize us, erase us, censor us, evaporate us, and we cannot allow that. We got parents, we got grandparents, great-grandparents who fought for us to be here. We didn't come later. We've been here since the beginning. And we cannot allow our presence to be erased by narrative that's false, a narrative that supports lies and contextualizes what's happening in ways that destroy us. So that it's an honor to be present at the National Puerto Rico Museum, porque we have built an institution that will survive not us, but will be here for the future. So the question for today, and this is a series called Absolutely Black, because we understand that in the work that we're doing, one has to identify where you stand, racially, culturally, so that we can withstand the forces that are operating against us. And I say operating against us because when you say that we're poisoning the blood of a country that our people founded and were here present when you arrived and colonized, right? Then you're talking about lying, out and out lying. And when you're talking about changing the curriculum, now you know that's wrong. Because many of us who come up in the 60s and 70s, and that's a good thing about aging because you have history and you can talk about history, right? I was there, right? We fought for the presence of our African heritage, our native heritage, and all that we represent in the planet. So that you want to now come and change it? That we learned from enslavement? Give me a break. So that, how do we sustain what we have built? How do we sustain institutions across the nation that are like El Museo here, right? That protect, provide a safe space for our artists to work, our cultural workers to work, our children to come through and feel valued, protected, and loved, and cherished? We can't let that go, and we won't. So we have invited people that have supported us over time, have experienced what we have experienced in building, to give insight into avenues and paths that we need to be considering as we move forward. Porque nosotros nos callamos. There's no silencing us. So let's be very clear. There's no censoring our voice. There's no censoring our writers, our visual artists. There's no censoring. But it's clear that we need a narrative, a joint narrative going forward that places our history, our perspective, our philosophies, our values, our ethics, so that all understand what the battle is, not only for us, but for everyone in this nation. Because to silence one is to silence all. But let's be very clear. So that the intentionality of building and sustaining Afro-Latino and Latinx institutions is the conversation. And I would like to introduce you to the panelists that are friends of our institutions and ask them to share their insights and their guidance as we go forward. Ana Maria, who is the president of Hispanics in Philanthropy. Eddie, and you have your program, so you know the listeners, Eddie Torres. But we're treating them as family because they are family. They reflect us. President of Grant Makers for the Arts. Perry, President and CEO of the Dusau Museum. Susan, President and CEO of APFI, which stands for African American Philanthropy and Foundation. And you heard from Veronica, fire. And it's a joy to have intergenerational representation right on the panel as well as speaking, because if we don't survive this, right, our children and our children's children will survive to continue what we have instituted. So we're not doing this for us. We're doing this for generations going forward. So I present the question that Billy Ocasio was the one that said, I want to speak about the institutionality of building our institutions, sustaining Afro-Latino and Puerto Rican and institutions, that cultural workers want to reflect their communities, right? So this is about everybody. That we have voice, that we have presence is in our hands. So every one of you is responsible, as Veronica said, to doing it. We do it with our children in the homes. Parents are the first teachers, grandparents, también, los titis, los abuelos, right? How do we sustain institutions like this as safe spaces for our young people and our community? So I pose it. Whoever likes to speak first. And this is a conversation. These are not presentations like, like in your school, somebody's gonna make a presentation. This is the living room. This is the living room with wine, and you're talking to your titis, your uncles, the people that reflect you and love you. Okay. So how do we sustain ourselves?
Let me just make sure this is on. Okay, good. I mean, one of the main things that we try to impress upon our Grantmaker members at Grantmakers in the Arts is that when people use DEI, diversity, inclusion, and equity, it's a turn of phrase we don't use, because what we're trying specifically to focus on is equity, not diversity and inclusion. We have no problem with diversity and inclusion, but the problem that we do have with it is that it's become a way for predominantly white institutions to be rewarded for bad practice. And so what we're focused on is self-determination by communities of color. So what we're asking for is, when you're giving a grant, is it by, for, and about communities of color? And specifically, is it by communities of color? Because that's self-determination.
Let me add a little bit here. The way things are right now, it's really scary, because the way these organizations justify the DEI is like, well, this is an on-ramp, and that way we can get deeper. Okay, not okay, but at least there's a justification. But we're going back now. They're even scrubbing the DEI. That on-ramp language is now being tamed, is now like people and planet. That's what they're starting to scrub the language, so we don't even have the DEI language because of the Supreme Court affirmative action decision that we had last summer. All of that we've worked for is really at risk, and I was going to talk about this later, and Susan and I can both talk about it because we're joined at the hip on this. I mean, anything that is a contract, which a grant agreement is a contract, is going to be at jeopardy. And so, yes, what you're saying is correct, but what this panel would have looked like last year and what it looks like now, I think is very different. And we have to be sober and realistic about that as well.
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's the work to sustain our institutions and our organizations, which is the lifeblood of our communities, right? Institutional power is what we need to move our agendas forward. ABFI has been doing this work. It's really the work that we do. It's 53 years of fighting the system. Our organization was founded through a protest at the Council of Foundations meeting in 1971, because the founders weren't taking anymore this issue about boardrooms being predominantly white, money going to predominantly white institutions. And so it's after 6. I spend a lot of time in Jamaica, and I hear Bob Marley in my head, right? And one of the things we have to do, what does he say? Emancipate our minds from mental slavery, right? Liberate our minds. We always have to remember, Dr. Marta, I believe we could talk about tactics, but we got to remember a couple of things. One, never sort of give in to the argument that there isn't enough money.
There are trillions of dollars in endowments, right? In foundation endowments. And many of you may know that foundations are only required to give away 5% of that, their grant making budget, right? The money is sitting in the endowment. We actually wrote a report a couple of years ago called, What About the 95%? Don't talk to me about the 5%. What about the 95%? So one, we have to, right, we have to remember and just keep in mind that there is money in this field, and never take, no for an answer, that grant budget is over. The other thing I want us to keep in mind is, whose money is it anyway, right? Whose money is it anyway? There is a really important report that just came out by a foundation called IF, a Foundation for Radical Possibility, called Cracks in the Foundation. And it tells the story of 4 foundations, right, in Washington, D.C., in that area, about how they organize their wealth. And guess whose backs they built it off of, right? So as we strategize, as we organize, we just have to liberate our minds and open up what the possibilities are. And we can talk about tactics to do it and all that, but I just want us to remember that.
So I'm going to jump in here and start from the very beginning, a very good place to start, right? We have a problem with baselines. We have a problem with false baselines. And why I say that is because it totally depends on what side of the mirror one is standing on, right? All of us in here, all of us around the world, do you think we're minorities in the world? No. We're a majority, right? So the diversity, I'm sorry, we're on the, we should be saying who can come in to our communities, to our groups, to our spiritual awareness and cultural connectivity, right? And I think there's always been, from the very start, a massive effort, spurred by fear, fed by fear, to keep us apart, right? Because whomever one believes in forbid that all these vines from the same African root get to twine around each other, get to build strength from one another, get to identify with one another, and the next thing you know, oops, here comes the truth. We're not a minority, right? And once we start within these institutions that we've built, that in my case, Dr. Margaret Burroughs built, and Billy helped build this, and you have Carlos who built the National Museum of Mexican Art, right? We are not the minorities, right? This entire nation was built on our collective backs, right? And that has to be acknowledged. It has to be faced. And that's the only way you have healing and equity and equality, is if you admit that it's messed up from the very beginning, right? So when Billy and I were involved in this big fight for our greater equity in funding from the Park District, we were looking at institutions that between 4 of them had endowments totaling more than $2 billion. That's with a B. And we were fighting and built a coalition of 7 out of the group of 11, white institutions and institutions of color, to say that's just not right. Because the money, whose money? Our money. Anybody who's paying real estate taxes in this city, and our money, right? And so I think, I'm reminded of the saying that to people in power, to those in power, equity looks like an impingement, looks like harm. It's a zero-sum game. It's never a zero-sum game. And we can't internalize the wish for it to be a zero-sum game.
Well,
I think the question becomes, because over time, I think that these power brokers, right, understand that we're present, understand that we're the majority, yet build narratives that say otherwise. So, what do we say, and how do we organize, and what is the narrative that we put forward, right? That I go to Nina Simone, compared to what? Right? Nobody can compare us to anything, and we can't compare ourselves to anything. So then, what is the narrative that says that the power that we have and the endowment that they have has to be divided differently, right? Because if we don't say it, who's going to say it? If we don't protect our own interests and the interests of our children going forward, who's going to protect them? I don't expect anybody to protect my granddaughter if we don't protect her, right? So then, how do we frame that as a narrative and as action in terms of moving the needle? Because they know this. I mean, we had a civil rights movement. Who was it? Who was it that created a curriculum that included us in the 60s and 70s? The Black Arts Movement, the Latino movement, the Chicano movement, the Young Lords movement that comes out of here, out of Chicago. The Black Panther Party, where does it come from? That same reality. And we're saying the same thing then that is happening now, but we have to change that action and change that narrative. So what is the change, right? And you're in the places that change doesn't want to happen, right? But now you've developed institutions, and we have institutions that reflect us. So how then does it work? What is the next step?
So I was at the Council of Foundations conference earlier this week, and somebody said something which is true, but it's not my quote, it's his quote. I think of Peter from the Hilton Foundation, the president. He said, philanthropy has no natural predators. And this is, to a certain extent, what's believed, but it's not actually true, because it, as we said earlier, it is public monies. So civic voice, our voice, can have an impact. Let's look at corporate foundations. Corporate foundations, if we were to organize around corporate foundations and what they're doing, there is a way to have an impact there. Community foundations, it's implied in the name, community foundations, they're responsible to our communities. We can have a voice there if we're organized, if we do it together. You said that there's wedges between our communities. That's what Susan and I are always talking about. How do we really bring our communities together? There's a lot of vested interest in separating us, and we have to constantly be working on that multiracial solidarity building. With private foundations and family foundations, again, there is legislation, there are Congress people who are always looking at how do we affect them. There is a Senate committee on philanthropy. So from my perspective, that's something that we can do that really isn't talked about very often. There's something called donor advised funds. Those are locked up, not transparent, black boxes. They can park their money there forever and it never comes out. So there's ways legally, legislatively, policy-wise, that we can unlock some of that money. Again, that 95%, which is where most of the money is, how do we make sure that it's invested in our communities? For example, at HIP, we have an impact investment, a venture fund called Inicio Funds. And Inicio is investing in amazing businesses in our community. Why don't, instead of investing in the stock market, why don't they invest that 95% in our amazing businesses? They're going to make a lot of money because our people are brilliant and like they're unicorns, but we don't have the money. Less than 1% of venture dollars comes to our communities. The same in the Black community, the same in for philanthropy, it's less than 1% comes to Latino nonprofits. So it's about being organized and paying attention and deciding that, yeah, basta, and we're going to do something about it.
Yeah, and to that point, I mean, from a legislative perspective, okay, we're seeing division all across the country, all across the world, really. And thinking about this 5% rule, where did that come from, right? It came from very wealthy people starting a foundation. I'm being a little cynical here now, to be able to keep hold of their money, shelter that money from taxes, right, as a nonprofit entity, and only have to give away the bare minimum. So why are we not fighting to even get 10% with that additional 5% going completely to equity, right? So in other words, give that first 5 to all the people you're trying to give it to right now anyway, all right? But we're going to require another 5%, and that's going to go to historically underfunded institutions, businesses. It's really not rocket science. It's a shell game, right? It's not rocket science. And I think, when we talk about unity, I truly believe that the power of unity is greater than the power of fear. And I believe we're going to see that in November.
Right.
Because if we don't, we talk about institutions surviving, we won't survive. As individuals, as communities. My granddaughters, 7 and 11, you never would have had me believe that they would have fewer rights, less autonomy over their own bodies than I did growing up in the 60s and the 70s. Can't have it. Not on our watch.
And I would add the narrative. I've heard sayings like we won't win the policy until we win the narrative, right? We can't win the campaign until we win the narrative. And that's what opposition is actually excelling at right now, is the narrative. They're taking our words, turning them around, making up stuff, created a whole definition for critical race theory that isn't even true, and then attacked it, right? They're winning the narrative. They are loud. I heard Stacey Abrams the other day, someone who I just sit at her feet and learn, say we have to be loud with our narrative. And so I know all of our organizations are, and then to pick up Anna Marie on, you said organize at least 3 times. This is organizing work within the sector that we're trying to do. It's tough work, but we are organizing. We're trying to build power to move the institutions that our members actually sit in. But getting more resources to tell the right narrative. Dr. Marta, as you say, there isn't a major movement, social movement in this country where Black-led organizations weren't in the front. Whether you're talking about civil rights, whether you're talking about women's movement, is racism in the movements, of course, right? The LGBTQ and queer movement. And we need to get that story out, which means we have to invest in the narrative. But the other thing I'll just raise here, being in the work of philanthropy, being at ABFI now for, 14 years, I want to also lift up our own philanthropy in our communities. I think we have got to get more strategic and smarter, because to some extent, we're going to run into these challenges about institutional philanthropy built off our backs, as, tax shelters for the rich. So we've got to be real about what this sector is. More money is given away every year by individuals over foundations, right? Philanthropy in this country is really individual. And so what does it mean for organizations like us, for all of us actually, to be more intentional on organizing our own money, right, to move the work that we need to move? I think that's part of the strategy moving forward. Yeah.
I completely agree with everything that you've said, and I really want to underline one piece about courageous narratives, narratives of victory, narratives of success. My predecessor at Grantmakers in the Arts used to say, philanthropy is a field born out of love and administered out of fear. And the way that risk gets framed is not only damaging, but it's also just flat out false. The narrative that organizations of color are risky investments. We actually run a workshop on financial health. We've looked at the data. The data is, when you look at liquidity, at cash on hand, just the ability to be able to summon 3 to however many months cash on hand to pay your bills, organizations of color are actually better at liquidity than predominantly white institutions. They're better financial managers. They're better financial managers because they've had no choice but to be for generations. But what that means is, when you look at a risky investment, they're the least risky investment. Increased investment in communities of color is the least risky investment. It's not the most risky investment, and that narrative needs to change.
And yet, like the benchmark study, Cheryl Dorsey echoing Green, which was put out, it was during COVID, so I guess 3-4 years ago, shows, and I think you've all seen it, but just in case, it's Echoing Green, if you don't know it, it's an amazing program. They bring fellows, cohorts of fellows every year. They've been following the same curriculum, the same archetype of person that they recruit. And they give them the same curriculum, the same resources when they graduate from the program. And then they track them over, how long is it, Chris? Like, it's at least 30 years, 20, 30 years. So there's a long-term study there. And what do we see? Those leaders, the white leaders of CEOs, because these are all CEOs of white-led organizations, have so much more money than the people of color leaders. And so those folks, when COVID came, or when any other emergency, when the recession came in 2008, any kind of, or when there's opportunities, are able to pivot. They're flexible, they can adjust because they have plenty of resources and reserves in the bank. We have to be scrappy and resilient and beg and take from here to move there. And so this is documented in this Echoing Green with Bridgespan report. So again, I'll say it, ya basta. It's like, we can't, how are we supposed to lead our communities and work with our communities and get to this supposed place of thriving instead of surviving?
I think that the question becomes, when have we been the most powerful to change policies, to change directions? The last conversation was in Texas, Austin, Texas, which we canceled because the professors, and rightly so, were supportive of the students, as we were supportive of the students. There's power in our bodies. And praise to our young people, because across the nation they have stopped. So during the civil rights movement, how did we make this nation face itself? It was our bodies. How do we use our bodies in 2024 going forward in ways that will change the narrative about us and will change the laws that are illegal? Because we did a panel about 2 years ago, which we called When the Law is Not the Law. And let's be very clear. What are we talking about when the law is not functioning as the law? When the Supreme Court is not functioning equitably and can make the decisions that will stymie your granddaughter or my granddaughter and your children, right? So that how do we use our presence, our numbers in ways? How do we use a legal system that's illegal in many instances and call it such to change the structures that have been developed that are inequitable? And we know they're inequitable. And it goes to the point of you take 5% and go to 10%? Hell no. You know what I'm saying? Because then it changes in 10 or 20 years. So the question becomes is how do we use our knowledge and our numbers to affect change in a way that outlives our generations going forward? I mean, when these changes happen, all of us come out of the civil rights movement, at least you and I do, right? So we see the changes that we make, and we see them purposely being destroyed in front of our faces. So what is that action that we take at this point in time, 2024 going forward? Because we're in a critical moment in the history of this nation.
Here we are. That's true, we are. And I'll say, you know, when you get to be a certain age, I'm officially on Medicare, right? And the older we get, the less we care about saying the wrong thing, right? Because if we're saying it, it's usually the right thing, right? And I say it's a very simple, there's a very simple solution, you know, in this day of technology, give everybody a DNA test and then remind them of the one drop rule.
I love it.
I love it. Changing their mind really fast.
You know, I love that. Using the legal system, the illegal system, right? Using our bodies just reminds me of a few things, Dr. Marta. One is, you know, thank goodness we have, again, there are institutions. I think about, I was on the phone with Tom Saints today from MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. There is no coincidence about the fact that the board election that we just held at ADFI 3 weeks ago, we elected 3 civil rights attorneys to our board. I mean, that is new for us. We're working in the field of philanthropy, but the fights are in the courts right now. The fights are in the courts. And so Damon Hewitt from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law is now, I am just happy to say, a board member. One of the things that we're trying to do is get more civil rights attorneys actually into the field of philanthropy, because we have learned that the risk aversion, right, and concern about foundations getting sued in this political climate, because it's just tougher right now, given the opposition's push and attack. We've got to ensure that foundation general counsels and attorneys have everything they need to help us win. Now, albeit their jobs are to protect the institutions in which they work, right? But we can help bring different thinking, different ideas to this group of folk who, quite frankly, prior to the Supreme Court decision, were pretty much invisible to me. And I've been in the field for over 25 years of philanthropy and wasn't really focused on the attorneys who really have a lot to say about how foundations are investing in racial justice and explicit, you know, grant making for the Black community, African descendant community. So one is, you know, we have to think about priorities when we're talking about moving resources from the sector in this moment. And I just, you know, the MALDEFs, the legal defense funds around the country, we have to make sure they have what they need. And again, I'm also going to lean on individual donors, because I think that's where we're going to find our liberation, is not from foundations, but from our own indigenous philanthropy. We are the most philanthropic people in the world, and it's not tapped and organized well. So we've got to get, you know, again, more legal folks on our side to help philanthropy sort of open up the coffers. And how to use our bodies, Dr. Marta, it was Chicago. I'll never forget, I see some of my friends here, Deborah Bennett's here, Heather's here, and there was a brother I'm going to speak his name, Phil Jackson from the Black Star Project. Y'all remember Phil Jackson from Black Star? Yes. And he was the first person that I heard use the term philanthropic redlining. And we picked it up at ADFI and ran with it. But what he did actually was organize protests on certain foundations here in this town, right? Because of their philanthropic redlining. We are part of the movement. We are not up in foundations and sitting on the side, we are part of the movement. Similarly, young sister Heather Infantry, who now runs a group called Giving Gap, which is to address the giving gap for Black-led organizations in this country. She was in Atlanta prior to taking that position, and she organized protests against foundations in Atlanta and brought attention to it. The data is actually public. 990s are the documents in which we all have access to, where we can track philanthropy's redlining. And so we've got to figure out how to get that information, I think, more into the hands of the people. Because what was it, Frederick Douglass? Power concedes nothing without demand, never has, never will. We need external push to help our foundations actually move. So I think that's how we use our bodies.
Yep. That's how we started this conversation. Organize, organize. Yeah. The other thing is this mentality of we're going into them suplicando, begging, asking, supplicants. I'm tired of that. Like, please, 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 please help us. No, that's why something that you said, which we're doing at HIP, because it has to be a multi-pronged ecosystem approach. It can't be just one thing. But how do we move money, and how do we do that in significant ways, leveraging what you said, our numbers? And so we're developing giving circles, crowdfunding, our own DAFs, donor advised funds, but community DAFs, right? So that they're about us, for us, by us. So that we can go and we can say, if you want to invest in a winner, you can co-invest in us and with us, but we're going to be the majority. And so other on-ramps and pipelines and ways in which we're developing opportunities for us to come together to invest in our communities, and that we're the lead investor, I think is really important.
And I want to plus one all of that, and also just add to that, again, these narratives of fear. There are so many foundations that are convinced that they can't support your efforts at changing public policy. That's not true. They can. It's completely legal. There's a couple of different steps you have to take to do it, but they can support you to advocate for changes to government policy and government practice. They've been advised for generations by their lawyers not to, because it does create some risk for them. But so what? You know who's advising them that they can? Conservative philanthropy. And that's why we're in this situation. And you know why you haven't heard of those foundations? Because they're not wasting their money on their communications budget. They're giving it to organizations that are organizing for the right? I mean, the political right, I mean. So, again, they just have to be able to support us. They can, and they're just too afraid right now. We just have to make clear to them, yes, you can.
So how do we make that clear? Is it at a foundation summit meeting, let's say, put together by grant makers? I mean, the reality is that one of the questions that Billy brought up is, how do we go directly to people who are giving money? Because now the practice was, and I saw that practice about 20 years ago, that they give money to large institutions that are getting money to then call us for our mailing list, call us for assistance in doing Latino things, Black things, Native things, and so on and so forth, right? Co-opting the kind of programming that we've been doing, right? And who gets the larger sum of the money? Not us, right? So that the question becomes, how do we get them in a room to hold them accountable? And we can be nice. We know how to speak nice. You know what I mean? But how then does that message get across? Because I have been in this, we have been in this, right? And we have had those conversations over time. Now, my mother used to say there's not a deaf person that doesn't want to hear. Anybody that doesn't want to hear is a deaf person because they choose to be, not because they are, right? So that the question becomes, how do we get people in the room to have that communication that if we are developing programming that is grounded in our communities, informed by our communities, researched and documented by our communities, why are you giving somebody else money to do what we do? To undermine what we do, right? And then whitewash it all, right? Using Veronica's words, basically it is a system of white supremacy.
That's
Right, because it could be
the
a
basis
black
of all
thing,
of
but
it.
then when you look at it, it's like that's not our story. That's not the story of our creators.
And that's where it comes back to who narrates our stories, right? We have to reclaim our own voices and narrate our own stories, which are the complete and truthful stories, right? That we tell about our history because we lived it. This isn't a revisionist history game. They're trying to make it that, but that's not what it is. Why do those four institutions that Billy and I were ticking off, I was going to say something else, have $2 billion of endowments? Because they have had generational wealth. Their trustees, board of trustees, have had generational wealth coming from industries that were built on the backs of slave labor, right? And Georgetown found out, right, what happened with their history and uncovered that. We need to do that with all of the corporations and all of the foundations, because it's time. I'm running out. I can't see that far. I'm gonna introduce a term here, and it is called institutional reparations. Institutional reparations. And I think that's something that we can all get behind.
So I'm going to ask us to consider maybe not working through the CEOs, the paid executives, which are paid to avoid fear and risk, but maybe to work through trustees and board of directors, the folks who are usually volunteers on these boards, who this is not their day-to-day business. This is not they usually have other day jobs, and to educate the trustees and the boards about what's going on and why this is important. It's a strategy that we're just starting in earnest in the past several years, but I don't think that we have done it at the scale that needs to be, but we are thinking about that. But trustees is one way that I'm optimistic about changing hearts and minds and these are the people that are setting strategic direction for the foundations. The CEOs are paid to avoid stories in the paper, avoid risk, avoid anything.
Well, in our self-interest, I guess I asked the question, how do we organize, or should we organize? And I say yes, because I am not, como digo, without opinion, without intent. And this panel was around intentionality. How do we move forward organizing, okay, and legally to question that 5%? Because I don't think that this is new to anybody in foundations, that there is rumors and rumbling about, hey, why don't we get more? Because it's our money out of our backs. So then it's on us to organize to take the next step. Even in an atmosphere that is problematic in all of its levels of construction at this point. So is that the next step?
It's definitely part of it. I think it's so multifaceted, and organizing is happening. We've got to, build it, make it more robust, and part of it is, there are just the realities, and I don't want to I don't pull back on anything that I said. Um, we are about transforming the sector at AbbVie for responsive philanthropy in Black communities. As I said, our organization has been around many years, and we are fighting structural racism inside of the sector, basically. This does a terrible thing to Black people that work in foundations, right? It's not an easy place to be. And so we have this dual sort of concern and challenge about how do we organize our folks. We have 2,000 members at AbbVie, right? And some are nonprofit organizations as well that push, that pull, that nudge, and need to heal and need respite as well. So I just lift that up, that the churn of Black folks and people of color through these institutions is real. We did a report called the Exit Interview about 6 years ago, because we saw, and we see it now, particularly Black women are leaving the sector, either pushed out, fired, or burnt out and sick. God forbid, let me say her name, Janine Lee, my girl, right? And so I just want to say that there are fights going on in these institutions to the issues of policy around 5% and the like, but just the reality of how we do this. We need to better connect with community, right? So, and Dr. Marta, that's what I take for your question in terms of the next step, is that we have to be better connected. That is, people of color inside of foundations with community. That's where the organizing needs to happen. Because like I said, the information that is out there, I've thought for many years, how do we get the 99D simplified so I can get them in your hands, right? So that you can use that in, pushing a foundation to do the right thing. The other thing is, I also should say on this issue of 5%, there are leading foundations out here. There are foundations that go way above that policy. And we just have to lift them up and figure out how they work with their peers. That's something that we've got to sort of be more intentional about as well, because they're out there. They're out there.
And it's important, I think, to identify those foundations, right? And show folks that, hey, guess what? They gave 10%. They're still around. They're still plenty wealthy, right? So it's not, nobody died. Except the Black people, right? But I think we start at 20% and settle for 10 or 15. There's strategy to that. But I think too, and I say this a lot. I say this probably almost every day, and people get tired of me saying it. But we have got to get out of our silos, right? We have got to stop thinking of this money that as a competition between ourselves, right? Because as you said early on, there is plenty of money. We've just been brainwashed to think that only a portion of it, this little portion, is all that's going to be given to us colored peoples, and no more. And so we have to fight over that $20, right? When there's actually $200 million out there that we have as much a right to as anybody else, right? And so we have to stop internalizing these external limits. And again, it's about what side of the mirror are you standing on? It's about an Alice in Wonderland thing, right? Come to my side of the mirror. Okay? Then let's see what rules you make, right? So I think that is really it, getting together. Stop buying into this divisiveness, right? Stop being as ready to jump on one another, and instead of doing the very thing that the establishment fears the most, which is coming together in greater numbers and with greater power and greater voting power than all of them, right?
And plus one to all of that, and also, you know, when I got to grant makers in the arts, you know, racial equity in arts funding was a program, and we basically said, okay, now how do we turn this into something that exists in every program that we have, including impact investing, so that people are looking at racial equity when they're looking at that 95%, or in our financial health workshops, so that we're talking about organizations of color being the least fiscally risky. You know, at one point, I literally did this. It was a couple of years ago, we had a racial equity and arts funding workshop. We'd put it up online. With this one, we had actually made critical race theory the central frame for the workshop. So we're watching registrations come in, and we're seeing virtually nothing coming in from any of our public sector funders. There's no government funders signing up for this, right? Government funders are about a quarter of our members, so usually they're at least a quarter of our workshop registrants. So then I said, wow, you've got the conditions here for a perfect experiment. I literally just went on the website and I cut out the words critical race theory. And then the government funders started coming in, right? Then I put the words back in, the government funders stopped coming in, right? But those ones that came in, they were registered. They took the workshop.
I think there's a call, or maybe I'm pushing it, but I pushed it. There's a call for us to organize, the community to organize, right? That's why we opened it to a public for discussion. Because ultimately, it's our responsibility to push the envelope, right? And also protect, to the degree we can, those that are within positions that are questioning, that the employee is going to be questioned, you know, about their participation in any activity. But I learned early on from people who are organizers like Antonia Pantoja, right? And so many others that, you know, brought me on when I was beginning to build institutions or interested in being part of institutions. They were very clear that there's a cost that you take for justice. Yes. There's a cost that you take for equity. And if you're not willing to do that, then don't enter. Let's be very clear, because you're bucking a system that wants to keep inequity. It's not that they're ignorant. So the question becomes, what are you willing to risk? And to what degree you risk? The students that are out there have said what they're willing to risk. Each and every one of us at this point in history, in this country, has to decide what's that point for us. And I would say that the need to organize and work together, and this is part of the intent of the series, is to connect us across the nation, to understand what we're facing, and we have already faced, right? With the loss of, and the majority here are women, the right to our bodies and the right to our children's bodies. And it's not going to stop there, and we know that. We know that it's not stopping. We see it escalating every day. So the question becomes, what is our commitment to us? And how do we organize going forward across racial lines so that we're not being divisive about each other, but working for our mutual interests. Right? So with that, I'd also like to say that this series was organized in collaboration with not only the organizations like the museum that have hosted us, but the Afro-Latin Forum, and Miguel Lopez. Miguel Lopez is here representing the forum, because it's important that we partner with each other. None of us are isolated from each other. And cell phones, if they have a good thing to do, is to connect us, and we don't have to move out of our living rooms. How we use them and the intentionality of using them and for what we use them becomes critical at this point. But certainly organizing to assure that institutions like this continue into the future is critical, not only for Chicago, but for the institutions we were with in California, for the work that's being done in Texas, for the work that's being done in Washington, and all of the places we've been. The importance of connecting and having conversations and knowing each other, right? Because many times, you know, and you were touching on it, we have this internal discrimination against each other, right? And we have to let that go.
But that was built. That was intentional.
It was
It didn't come
intentional,
from
of
us.
course. But we have to let it go.
Yeah.
We have to let it go, because even in our own communities and in our own families, the lighter child is preferred and the darker child is not. And we know that, right? We have internal racism. We have internal discrimination, right? Because este nació aquí, este no nació en Puerto Rico, pero nació en el barrio, all of that. We got to let go. Because if we don't, what does the future look like? And we're seeing a glimpse of it. The Supreme Court decision is not the only one that's going to come down. And we have to be clear on where we go and how we move forward. So this is your turn. This is open now to the public for questions and how to move forward. We don't want sermons. Entiende? We don't want sermons. We want you to be constructive in your thinking and intentional in your thinking, so that all of us who are going to pull this together with you have a direction to go in. So we don't want to hear about, you know, the rain and all the things that you are experiencing in the moment. We want constructive direction. Yes? Done. And identify with your name también, please.
Hello, my name is Melissa Dupre of the Whole Park Dupres. It's such an honor to be in the space with you all, and thank you all for the work that you do and everything that you shared. I'm fully aware that this is an institutional conversation tonight, fully aware. And I'm coming here in this space as an artist, as an actor, comic, playwright, as a culture creator, and also a spiritualist and a person 3 generations invested in this community. And I'm finding it so challenging on how we can bridge the gap between institutions and artists, where artists are also part of this narrative. When you speak on doing work by, for, with, and in, some of these institutions are leading with artists. We're in a gallery where these artists are curated, right? Where artists are holding the power of the archive, and the institutions are back. When I go for a grant, the first question that they ask me is, who's backing you? And I go, keep sweat, nobody, right? As an individual artist, it becomes so much more inaccessible for some of these art fundings. UIC just did an arts funding survey where 70% of the arts funding allocated to the state goes to the north and northwest sides of Chicago alone. That does not include rural communities. That's for the state. And all of those are predominantly white institutions, and I'm from a generation where institution has become a pejorative word, because it requires me to do more work to be in relationship with an institution that is not looking for me. right? They're not looking for people like me. And we're having the most shallow pool, but then I'm getting invited to the White House, and the White House is asking me, who should we be giving money to because they see me as an individual artist. And so the artists are also at the forefront of social media. These young people are holding so much narrative that the institutions, it would behoove them to have that relationship. So how do we bridge the gap between us, because we are holding and really anchoring that archive that you also really need for budget for rooms like these, spaces like this.
Great, thank you. That's a critical issue. How do we and the artists become a part and voice in going forward? And you've always had voice, because if it wasn't for the artists articulating in whatever way, right, what the issues are, you are storytellers, truth tellers. So how do we honor that, right? So
I know
thank
that
you.
from our perspective, every time that we do an event, we always feature local artists in the music, in the awards that we give out. Everything is focusing on the local artists and lifting that up. But you probably have other ideas from your perspective.
Well, first of all, that's fantastic that you do that, and we do it also. But two other things that we do is, one, we have an entire body of work around encouraging foundations and government agencies to support individual artists. There is no art without individual artists. There are no institutions or organizations without individual artists. They're the most important part of the cultural community. But the other thing that we do is we have a body of work specifically around advocating for changes to government policies. And when I first got to the organization, it was just around support the NEA, ... the kind of very typical stuff. But we actually began advocating for pro-worker policies because artists are workers who deserve to get paid. So now we're advocating for universal basic income. We're advocating for universal health care for all, because these are all policies that help all workers, and artists are workers. The idea that artists should be treated as separate from society is harmful for workers, and it's harmful for artists.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments as we move forward? Yes.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm from New York. I worked at a major institution with a development staff of about 50 people. And I kind of realized very quickly how there's a false sense of meritocracy in grant writing, where you have 50 people dedicated to chasing about $100 million, right? So most of the decisions that were made were not through my grant writing, but at the dinner table after concerts. How do you have any advice for grassroots organizations who are doing the cleaning, the permitting, the development, into pursuing the money that's being given at the dinner table? Or is that something that you can advise? Thank you.
Am I going to be answering all of it?
Well, let me address. I was at on the state council, right, as a member, and I withdrew. And the reason I did so was because I realized that the decisions were not made at the council, right? Because oftentimes what happened was that because people had such vested interest or relationship with those large institutions that you're talking about, there couldn't be quorum at the table unless my face and other faces like me were present. So then I stopped being part of the council because I said, the decisions are not being made here. They're made after, in circles of entertainment and after hours. I don't know how you stop that. And I'm not in those levels because I think of myself. I invite to my house who I choose to. I hang out who I choose to, right?
My friends are not millionaires, right? So they're not going to give millions, or they're not going to decide on what goes to a next institution. But the reality is that, you can't stop people from socializing at the level that they socialize. So that the reality becomes, how do we use the legal system of philanthropy or their rules to question them, right? And not only question them, but if there's legal action that has to be done, then it has to be done. And what structure do we create and develop to make that happen? Right? Because it goes to what Ana Maria is saying, tú no quieres siempre estar mendigando. Y uno está mendigando, right? You're writing proposals and you're talking and you're talking and you're talking, right? And that's part of the process, but it's not all the process, which is your point, right? So how do we get to that other level of the process? And the question to me, or the challenge to me, is then, if there are laws and bylaws that run foundations, examine those bylaws, and wherever it is questionable or deficient, then address it in whatever way necessary, or whatever means necessary, right? So I think that that's the way that we go, or the next steps that we go.
I have a couple of thoughts on that. Recognizing the ugly truth that it is often about relationships. So let's recognize that that is. And that often, and there's something that I have a love-hate relationship with, because there's a lot of foundations that actually don't even allow you to submit a proposal. They don't take unsolicited proposals. I don't like that. But also, the ones that do, it's already primed often, right? So you're wasting your time. So at least they're being honest, and you don't have to waste your time, but it's not a good system. But it's good to know that. But I talked to you about the trustees and changing the face of what trustees look like. We also have to change the face of the decision maker. So we have, and you have as well, a mid-career program where we are taking folks from nonprofits, and it's 50-50, 50% nonprofits, 50% people from foundations, so that every year we have a cohort of 30. We already have 300 folks that have gone through our Líderes program, and training them about how it is to survive in philanthropy, so that we don't have that burnout, how it is to have tools for healing, but also what does trust-based philanthropy look like? Because we know that they're going to eventually get poached from the nonprofit sector into philanthropy, and we want them to be ready and not to waste any time and to be able to hit the ground running. So not a perfect answer, but just a couple of thoughts that help maybe frame.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, hello everyone. My name is Adriana Maxwell, and I read a study a couple years ago that when businesses started by people of color, their leadership and their employees are usually people of color, but as they expand and grow, their employees and their leadership start to whiten. So a question I have is, as these institutions are building and growing, what are ways that the communities they are intended to serve are still centered, included in the leadership, just considering the fact that a lot of philanthropy is, and a lot of the grants are administered by rich white people.
So are you talking about institutions that we create as that after time they whiten?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I haven't seen that.
Yes.
Or you mean foundations?
You mean organizations founded by Afro-Latinos or Latinos or African Americans after time? Are you talking about? Oh, businesses. Okay, I don't have any information on that.
I mean, it's the same protectionism, right? It's the same fear. Uh-oh, they're getting too close. Uh-oh, they're getting too big. Uh-oh, they're making too much money. Uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. And that's when the fear kicks in, right? And so, again, I go back to this, what side of the mirror are you on, right? So when you talk about wealthy Black people and you talk about wealthy Hispanics, you talk about wealthy communities, right? Who were the ones who were held up most high, especially by our young people? The athletes, the artists, okay? So since they have kind of decided that, you know, we're only good for, what did the chick on Fox News say? Just shut up and dribble. Okay. Yeah. Well, why not get those dribblers and those kickers and those and the singers and the performers, and let's make that our philanthropic base, right? And start organizing around non-corporate, right? Let's start organizing around those sectors that we have built, that there's no argument that we've built, that there's no argument that we're the wealthiest and most successful in, and just maybe flip the script, right? And well, and for my part, I'm putting my grandchildren in golf lessons.
No, that's important too. Actually, that's important too. I guess the way I was hearing your question and thinking about foundations, but also businesses, right? We have a major sort of interest in building economic power in Black communities, right? And part of that is about investing in and helping to scale Black businesses. You know, well-intentioned. Absolutely. But I think institutions are inherently racist. Hierarchical institutions that are built on capitalism and wealth, organized wealth, and generational are inherently racist. And so keeping a laser focus on the policies and the practices that push people out, people of color, right? As Anna Marie said, we have a fellowship program. When you think about the predominantly white sort of, you know, sector of foundations that brings folks of African descent in when they're like mid-career. They've been in the field for about 3 years. By the time they get to us, y'all, they're ready to leave. And I can't tell you, if I had a dollar for every time somebody said to me, Susan, if it wasn't for AbbVie, a Black, you know, a Black person, I'd be gone, right? If I had a dollar every time I heard that. I always say, and I would imagine there are parallels in business, you know, in corporate America as well, that we don't have a recruitment problem at all because we see the talent coming in to this sector. We can't keep them because it's hard. We got a retention problem. We don't have a recruitment problem. Yeah, and the larger an institution gets, particularly those that are organized, you know, in a hierarchy manner, again, built on wealth and systems of capitalism, I think institutions are inherently racist. And so I do, yeah. And so we just have to figure out how to organize to give people community, you know, a place to be with their people, and really give them all the fuel they need to stay in these institutions and fight for our people, right? So I offer those thoughts. Yeah.
It is a
Yeah.
fight.
And it's a fight.
It's a
Yeah.
fight.
Last common question, I'm going to leave it to our circle of this, and I'll come up with
Okay.
So, I wasn't going to speak. But I do want to, first of all, thank this wonderful panel, the organizers of because it was a necessary and obviously long due discussion. I want to remind all of us that part of the problem that we have around this question of unity, that we don't know our history very well. We have a long history. I want to think third. We have a long history in the Caribbean, in Latin America, where we developed immediately at the very moment of the incursions and the invasions and the conquest of this America a practice, which is maroonish, cimarrón, all right? And we could speak of sumi in Brazil, we could speak of yanga in Mexico, we can speak of comerío in Puerto Rico, or even cofresí in Puerto Rico. We could speak of macandal in Haiti. We could speak of penny in Jamaica. And we could go all over this continent and find incredible practices of building parallel institutions.
Right.
So when you
That's
speak
right.
about this museum,
That's right.
you're speaking about a parallel institution. And I want to make that clear because part of the problem of narratives is the narratives must be informed by canons. And we must rediscover our canons. And that is extremely important. If we don't do this, we will lose it. We're not taught. The issue with equity is a problematic one. Because if equity means to promote our people in different scales, whether we become part of the oppressors, that's not equity. And so we got to be careful with individualism in our practice. And we've got to speak about collective aesthetics, which are forebears in the Caribbean and all over Latin America, practice in those maroon societies. And I want to end by saying that the greatest example of maroonish was the first example created by a Taína woman. You'll see her upstairs, Ana Caona. She was not an African woman. She was an indigenous woman who, in the Baracu Mountains that divide what Quisqueya and Haiti, created the first maroon society, and there she welcomed runaway slaves, runaway Moriscos, Moors, runaway Jews, Sephardic Jews, and they built what today is our modern identity. So the issue of unity is already practiced in a historical context. The idea of parallel institutions is deeply rooted, and we really need to build a narrative on our own canons. That Jose Marti reminded us we have in an amazing essay he wrote, Nuestra América. So,
Thank you. We're planning un junte sobre maroonage in St. Croix. So, gracias por eso. Before we close, or I turn it over to Billy, I'd like to thank the museum and the museum team and staff for hosting us. The creative justice team that has been traveling across the nation doing this. Ashley, Sandra, Olga, thank you. And our panel, Marie, Eddie, Susan. Thank you for this conversation. And Billy, thank you for helping us.
So let's give him one more round of applause, please. So I'm going to close this by saying that on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered. I think it took that murder for foundations and corporations to take another look at us. And remember that foundations and corporations then said, you know, we're going to go beyond that 5%. They said, let's dedicate this amount of money towards people of color. And they did that. And we all were like, finally. But it took a death of someone to get us there. And so they did that for a little while. But Then the mainstream institutions said, well, wait up. Why are they getting that money and not us? And so what did they do? And so you'll see that the shift has gone again down towards that 5%. But the reason they did that was because then the foundation, these institutions, the mainstream institutions, started saying, let's us hire the Puerto Ricans. Let's us hire the people of color. Let's us start serving those communities. And so then they went to these foundations and they went to these corporations and said, wait up, we serve those communities. And so what happened here is that those foundations went back to the way things were. They went back to the way things were. And what they did was give the money to that institution and ask them to partner with us. You know, and it's been said here over and over again. So if I have one message for all of us that we need to continue to talk about and talk to everybody about it, is that no, just come directly to us. Come directly to us. If you want to serve the Puerto Rican community, then come to the Puerto Rican community. All right. Let me now just thank you all for coming here. We have a few exhibits. We're still open for another half hour here, so please enjoy yourself. But I do want to mention that on May 31st and June 1st, we are bringing in a Concilio Taíno from Puerto Rico, and they will be performing an areito ceremony on our grounds here. So please join us. I mean, it's one of those, if you've never been to one of these things, imagine our indigenous people and how they talked about the land and how they talked about us and how they brought us together. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Oh, yeah.